I have told this story only once before, to my wife, on the night of our wedding, when she pressed me to explain why I had wept at the vows. She listened in perfect silence while the candles burned low between us, and when I had finished, she took my hand across the table and said that she understood entirely, and that I was not to be ashamed of a single tear of it. I think of that conversation every time I look across the drawing room at Everard Valcourt, Duke of Valcourt, seated in his armchair beside the woman who became his duchess, the woman the household once called, behind her back and with considerable affection, the princess of the upper corridor. I was there the morning the secret finally broke. I was standing 3 feet from the door when it opened. My name is Mr. Theodore Ashby. I have been Everard's closest friend since the age of 7, when he pulled me out of a pond at his family's country estate in a manner that he later described as structurally undignified, and then refused to discuss for 30 years because he said the specific nature of the rescue had been embarrassing to us both. I will not say which of us had fallen in. What I will say is that Everard Valcourt, even at 7, had already formed the view that the world was best managed by silence and competence, and that visible emotion was something best concealed behind an impeccable coat and an expression of granite courtesy. The pond incident had simply confirmed the principle. By the time we were men, proper men, with London addresses and reputations and grey appearing in our hair, Everard had grown into a duke so formidable that invitations to his dinner table produced the same sensation in society as a politely worded summons from a magistrate. People attended. People were grateful. People did not, in general, argue with him. He was not cruel, I want to be clear about this, because cruelty is a small thing and Everard was not small in any respect. He was exacting. He had standards of behavior, of honor, and of household management that he applied to himself first and to everyone around him second. His tenants loved him with the particular devotion that capable men inspire. His valet feared him mildly and with great admiration. His mother adored him and complained about him in equal and perfectly balanced measure, which she considered the appropriate expression of maternal feeling. It was his mother's household that brought us both to Harlan Park in the spring of that year. The Dowager Duchess of Valcourt, a woman of very great warmth and considerable, quietly deployed will, had summoned us down from London on the grounds that the east wing roof required Everard's personal attention, and that she wished someone sensible present when the architect arrived to give his assessment. I had been included in the summons because, in the Dowager's words, Everard becomes extraordinary when confronted with tradesmen and estimates, and I need someone in the room to translate his expressions into actual answers. We arrived on a wet Tuesday afternoon. The house was exactly as I had always remembered it, vast, immaculate smelling of beeswax and old paper, and something faintly floral that I suspected came from the Dowager's particular preference in candles. It had that quality of light that long stone corridors in well-kept country houses seem to preserve in amber, as though the afternoon itself had been pressed between the pages of all the afternoons that came before it. We were shown to our rooms, we changed, and then the Dowager swept us both into the blue sitting room for tea and a detailed, passionate account of the roof's failings, the architect's preliminary errors, and her own firmly held opinions on the structural properties of Welsh slate, which she had apparently been researching. It was during this conversation, the Dowager was midway through a sentence about the inadequacy of the initial survey, that I first saw the girl they called the princess. She came in quietly, the way well-trained servants always do, without announcement, without haste, with the particular efficiency of a person who has learned to move through a room occupied by people of higher rank without disturbing the air. She was a lady's maid. I could tell by her dress, neat and dark, and by the precise, economical way she replaced the tea things, the old pot removed, the fresh one set down, the sugar repositioned 2 inches to the left, everything accomplished in silence and in seconds. She was about to withdraw. But when she straightened from the tray, she glanced up for a single instant, and I saw her face properly for the first time. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with the kind of face that does not announce itself all at once. That takes a moment to resolve into something you cannot easily look away from. She was not, in any fashionable or obvious sense, a great beauty. She was composed and fair-complexioned, with eyes of a color I could not immediately name, something between the gray of an overcast morning and the deep green of a river in winter. And there was something in the way she held herself, some quality of absolute interior composure, that struck me as so completely at odds with the room she was standing in, the position she occupied. that I found myself watching her cross toward the door the way one sometimes watches a figure in a painting, who seems to know something the viewer has not yet understood. She was gone in 4 seconds. The Dowager had not paused. That evening at dinner, I mentioned to Everard, in the casual way one mentions things one is actually quite interested in, that there was a lady's maid in his mother's household who carried herself in a manner that seemed rather at variance with her station. He said, without looking up from his wine, "Ashby, you have always noticed the wrong things." And then, "Her name is Miriam. The housemaids call her the princess. My mother calls her simply Myra and speaks of her extremely highly. She has been in this household 3 years." I noted that for a man who had arrived only that afternoon, this was a considerable amount of information. I chose not to say so. The following morning, the architect arrived. Everard disappeared into the east wing with the focused calm of a general riding out to inspect a disputed line, and I, having been excused from the inspection on the grounds that I lacked relevant knowledge and would only contribute remarks about the aesthetic qualities of the slate, wandered into the library to read. Reading made me restless. I walked upstairs. The upper corridor of the west wing has always had a particular quality of light through its long windows, and a plasterwork ceiling border of such delicacy that I had been meaning for years to examine it more closely. It was on this walk, honest intention, I maintained that I heard the sound. Paper, the specific whisper of it, the sound of many letters being moved with some urgency, and beneath it the almost inaudible murmur of a woman's voice speaking to herself in a tone that was too low for me to make out the words. The door to the small dressing room off the corridor was not fully closed. There was a gap of perhaps 2 inches, and through it came the sound of paper and the quiet voice and the slight scrape of something being repositioned against the floor. I had been about to walk past it. I was at that moment in the process of walking past it. Then the main corridor door at the far end opened, and Everard came in. He came the way he always came through a room, with the brisk, entirely unhurried certainty of a man who has never in his life needed to wonder whether he belonged where he was. He was looking down at a paper in his hand. He was making for the far staircase, which lay beyond the dressing-room door. I said his name softly, intending to redirect him. He did not hear me, or perhaps the corridor had that quality which old stone corridors sometimes do, of swallowing sound at the wrong moment. He glanced up, not at me but at the paper. He reached the dressing-room door. He turned the handle without looking at it and walked in. There was a silence of perhaps 3 full seconds. Then the door swung open fully under the momentum of his entry, and I could see inside. She was there, the girl they called the princess, kneeling on the floor beside an open traveling case with her hands full of letters. Dozens of letters. They were spread across the rug around her in arranged bundles, tied with different colored ribbons, some of the bundles larger than others, and she had clearly been in the middle of sorting through them when the door opened. She had frozen completely. The letters were still in her hands. He had frozen too. I stood in the corridor and did not breathe. What I remember most is her expression. Not fear precisely, though there was fear in it, but the look of a person who has carried something for so long and with such constant, effortful care that the moment of its near discovery hits not like surprise, which is sharp and sudden, but like the completion of a dread that has been accumulated for years. She looked at him the way a person looks who has rehearsed this exact scene in their own imagination many times over, always hoping never to find it occurring, and is now discovering that the imagined version was somehow both better and worse than the real one. Her hands, still holding the letters, did not shake. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. Everard looked at the letters in her hands. He looked at the bundles on the floor. He looked at the case. He said, in the tone he uses when he is cataloging a situation and deciding what it requires of him, measured, careful, without accusation, "You were not expecting me." "No," she said. "I was given to understand that the East Wing inspection would occupy your morning." "The architect was 20 minutes late," he said. And then he was quiet for a moment, looking at the ribbon-tied bundles arranged on the rug, and something in his face changed very slightly, not softened, not hardened, but sharpened with the attention he gives to things that do not resolve the way he expected them to. "Those are not my mother's letters," he said. "No," she said. "They are yours." "Yes." He stood in the doorway. He did not move toward the letters or toward her or reach for them in any way. He simply stood with his hands loose at his sides and his face, And this was the thing I noticed most from the corridor, deliberately, carefully open. As though he was choosing not to be formidable, which was perhaps the most formidable thing he had ever done. "Whatever they contain," he said slowly, "it is something you have been keeping private for some considerable time." She looked at him steadily. I could see her deciding. Every line of her preferred silence, 3 years in this house had taught her the particular grammar of it, the way a well-kept secret teaches its keeper to love the thing that protects them. But something in his stillness was working against that preference. Something in the fact that he had not moved, had not demanded, had simply waited. "They are letters from my father," she said at last. "My father was the Earl of Renwick." The past tense, he heard it. "He died 7 years ago," she said. "The earldom passed to a cousin. The cousin had reasons, financial reasons, primarily, and reasons of a different kind that were less easily named, to prefer that I not be publicly known to exist. As the Earl's legitimate daughter born in a lawful though private marriage, my existence would complicate his position considerably." Everard said, "You were hidden." "My father arranged it before he died. He had time to arrange it, which I am grateful for, though it cost him considerable effort in the months he could least afford the expenditure. I was placed in service in a household far from London, under a different surname, with a recommendation that made no mention of my origin. 3 years ago I was recommended to this household." "Does my mother know?" For the first time since he had walked in, something shifted in her composure, not a breaking of it, but a slight, involuntary change around her eyes, a tightening that might have been emotion or might have been something more complicated than emotion. "Your mother knows that I came from difficult circumstances," she said carefully. "She knows that the place named in my letters of recommendation was not the place I had actually been, and that the name on those letters was not entirely the name I was born with. She chose not to press me further." A pause. "I believe she considered it more important to understand what I was than to verify where I had come from." Everard said nothing for a moment. Then, "What are you doing with them this morning?" She glanced down at the letters in her hands, almost as though she had briefly forgotten she was still holding them. "The cousin died last month," she said. "His son has inherited. I do not yet know whether the son is aware of my existence, or whether, if he is, he considers it the same kind of inconvenience his father did." She looked back up at him. "I was reviewing what documentation I have, in the event that it becomes necessary to establish who I am." "Or in the event," Everard said very quietly, "that it becomes necessary to disappear again." She did not answer that, but she did not deny it either. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. I have known him long enough to recognize the particular quality of his silences, the way some of them are simply the absence of speech, and some of them are something else entirely. A rapid, serious, internal conversation that he holds with himself in the space between one sentence and the next. This was the second kind. "I would like," he said finally, "to read those letters, not now and not without your consent. This afternoon, if that is agreeable to you and if you are willing to bring them to the library. I would like to understand what you have and what it establishes." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. It was the most direct question I had heard anyone put to Everard Valcourt in many years. He absorbed it without flinching, without the slight withdrawal that most people would show at such directness from a person in her position. He simply met it. "Because," he said, "you have been in this house for 3 years. You have been under my family's protection, however unknowingly on my part, for 3 years. If something threatens you, it is therefore, to some extent, a matter that concerns me." She studied him with those gray-green eyes for a long, still moment. Then she said, 3 o'clock, in the library." And she looked back down at the letters, which was a dismissal as polite and final as anything I had ever witnessed. He gave a very slight nod and withdrew. I pressed myself around the corner and breathed, carefully, for what felt like the first time since I had heard the whisper of paper. At luncheon, Everard ate in near silence and appeared to be conducting internal calculations of some complexity. I made several remarks, about the weather, about a letter I had received, about a friend's new horse, and he responded at intervals with the distracted acknowledgement of a man whose attention is elsewhere entirely. When the plates were removed, I said, "The East Wing. What did the architect say?" "The Welsh slate," he said, "is irreplaceable and should have been maintained properly some 20 years ago. The work is straightforward if done correctly. I've commissioned it." He was looking at his coffee. "Ashby," he said without looking up. "Yes." If a legitimate daughter of a peer had been deliberately obscured from public record for purposes of inheritance, and if she possessed the original marriage documents and her own birth register, what would the process be to restore her standing? I considered this. 2 good solicitors, I said. A barrister for the title question. The original documents would need to be authenticated and registered. If the current holder of the title did not contest, the whole thing would be a matter of months, not years. And if he did contest, then it would take longer. But the documentation would matter more than the contestation, provided it was solid. Everard nodded, still looking at his coffee. "Thank you," he said. I took myself to the garden at 5 minutes to 3, which is where I always go when Everard is conducting a conversation I should not be witnessing. What I know of that afternoon in the library, I know from what they each told me afterward. Everard, in the fragmentary, reluctant way he tells things that matter to him, a piece at a time over many weeks, as though parceling the information allows him to maintain the fiction that he is not in fact telling you something of great consequence. And from Myra herself, much later after they were engaged, when she sat with me one autumn evening and said she supposed I ought to know how it had actually gone, since I had apparently been standing in the corridor. She had brought all the letters. Every bundle, the ones that documented her parents' marriage, the ones her father had written to her in the months before his death that had been kept by his solicitor until she was old enough to receive them, the letters from the clergyman who had known the full truth and had set it down in his own careful hand before his own death some years prior, and the original register entry, copied and certified, from the parish where the marriage had taken place. She laid them out on the library table in their order and told him, in the same level voice, what each one established. He read them all. It took the better part of an hour, and she sat across the table from him the entire time, watching him read, and did not speak unless he asked her a question, which he did at intervals, quietly, precisely, without drama. When he had finished, he folded his hands on the table and was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her, and this was the detail she told me with a softness in her voice that she generally kept very well governed, not what she wanted him to do with what he knew, but what she had been hoping might be possible. He had asked it in exactly those words, and she had found the question so unexpectedly careful, so different from the version of this conversation she had rehearsed in her imagination, that she had not answered it immediately. In the silence, he had waited. He had simply sat with his hands folded and waited, without impatience or the slight pressure that most people apply to a silence they consider too long. What she had been hoping for was modest, by her own admission. She had hoped to establish her name and her father's honor without becoming the subject of a legal dispute or a cousin's active attention. She had hoped in some quiet and official form to be acknowledged as herself. She had not allowed herself to hope for much more than that. 3 years of silence, she told me, teaches a person to be judicious with hope. Everard had listened to all of it. He had then said, precisely, efficiently, without sentiment, which she told me was exactly what she needed, which is perhaps why the sentiment hidden inside the efficiency reached her as it did. He knew 2 solicitors and a barrister whose competence he would personally guarantee. He knew the current Lord Renwick's man of business, with whom he had a professional acquaintance, and he believed he could convey, through appropriate channels, that pursuing any claim against her would be both legally inadvisable and personally unwise. He would write the necessary letters within the week, if she consented. She had looked at him for a long time. Then she had said, "Why do you know the man of business of a minor peer in Norfolk?" He had said, "We were at school together some years ago. I found him reasonable." She had said, "That is a reason to know him. It is not quite a reason to employ that acquaintance on my behalf." He had looked out of the library window. "No," he had said, "it is not." And that, she told me, was when she understood. The weeks that followed were not, by any measure, simple. Nothing in this story was simple, because Myra was not a person who permitted simplicity to stand in for truth, and she was not going to be swept into anything, however well managed, simply because a powerful man had decided to take her circumstances in hand. She was her father's daughter, and she had his precision and her mother's quality of stillness, and she held the line between gratitude and something warmer with a careful, quiet firmness that I suspect Everard had not anticipated. He engaged the solicitors. He wrote the letters. He managed the matter of the new Lord Renwick with a diplomatic firmness that left the young man's advisers in no doubt that the matter was closed, and that revisiting it would be inadvisable in every possible sense. None of this required that he see Myra. None of it required that he find occasions to be in the rooms where she was most likely to be, or that he develop a late and sustained interest in his mother's household accounts, which had not claimed 5 minutes of his attention in 20 years of regular visits. None of it required the books. The books appeared on the library table over a period of some weeks, quietly, without presentation, without any remark. They were of the sort she might want to read. Well chosen, interesting, not ostentatiously good. She read them. She left them back on the table with a small card marking a passage she had found particularly worth returning to, and said nothing about them, and he said nothing about them. And this continued for 3 weeks before I finally asked him directly what he thought he was doing. "I am being considerate," he said. "She has had a difficult 3 years, and she does not have many books of her own." "You have begun leaving novels," I said, "on a table in a room you previously used only for correspondence." He considered his brandy. "I read widely," he said. "Everard." He was quiet for a time. The fire was low. The room smelled of old wood and candle wax. Outside, the park was dark, and somewhere in the dark a late bird was calling. "She answered every question truthfully," he said at last, in the tone of a man making a report. "Every question I asked her in that room she answered, when I know that her preference was silence. She has governed herself on silence for 3 years, and she set it aside because I asked her carefully enough." He looked at the fire. "And when I finished reading those letters, the thing I felt most clearly was, not relief that the matter was manageable, not the satisfaction of a problem identified, but the very strong wish that she had not had to carry it alone. That someone had been there to carry it with her." He stopped. "I had not expected to feel that particular thing about anyone." I did not say anything. It seemed important not to. "She deserves," he said quietly, "to be asked, not managed. I am attempting to ask." The books continued. The cards continued. One afternoon I came into the library to find her there, reading, and Everard standing at the window with his back to the room in the particular stance that means he is trying not to disturb something he wants very much to continue. She looked up when I came in. He turned. For a moment the three of us occupied the room in a charged, companionable silence that I would have found comic in other circumstances. And then she said, placidly, that she had been about to make tea, and did I take mine with or without? And Everard said he would have his without. And the whole thing resolved into something so ordinary and so warm that I think I fell a little in love with the prospect of it myself, which is saying something since I was already engaged to my wife by that point. He asked her to marry him on an evening in October, in the rose garden, which had lost its roses, but retained a quality of late light that I am told was very fine. He told me about it 3 days later, in the way he tells things, a piece at a time, with long pauses, as though measuring what each piece costs to give away. He had, he said, told her that she had kept her own counsel for 3 years in an occupied household without a single person being certain of what she was carrying, and that he thought this was one of the most remarkable feats of character he had encountered, and that it was one of many things he thought about when he thought about her, which he did, he said, with considerable frequency and with no sign of diminishing. He had asked her if she would consider his company, permanent company, not the library and the cards and the carefully managed proximity, as something she might want. She had said, he told me, that she would need to think about it. He had said that was entirely reasonable. She had thought about it for 4 days. On the 5th day, she came to find him in the study, where he was working at his correspondence, and she had sat down across from him without being asked to sit and said, "I have been thinking about the question you asked me in the rose garden." He had set down his pen. She had said, "I grew up being managed. My father managed my concealment out of love, and the households I served managed me out of indifference, and the situation managed me because that was simply the nature of situations. I had decided at some point in the last 3 years that if there was ever a choice, I would not again be managed without being asked." A pause. "You asked," she said, "that is the reason." He had looked at her across the desk. She told me, with an expression she had not previously seen on his face, which was something she described, carefully, as a person looking at something they had not expected to find and finding it to be exactly what they needed. They were married in the autumn in the private chapel at Harlan Park, with the Dowager in the front pew wearing the expression of a woman who has been right about something for a very long time and is now, at last, being permitted to show it. The letters from her father, properly attested and registered, had established her name in the cold, spare language of official documents. Miriam, legitimate daughter of the late Earl of Renwick, born in lawful wedlock. She was acknowledged. She was herself. I stood beside Everard at the altar. The chaplain spoke. When Myra came down the aisle in pale gold, her dark hair dressed simply, carrying herself with that extraordinary contained dignity that I had noticed in those first 4 seconds in the sitting room, Everard looked at her with an expression I had never seen on his face in all our years of friendship. It was the look of a man who has spent a great many years maintaining a careful distance from the world, and has set that distance down, entirely, and found to his own considerable surprise that the world he has stepped into is warmer than he had allowed himself to believe. I am not ashamed of the tears. I stand by them entirely, and if pressed I would cry them again. Afterward, in the drawing room, Myra found me for a moment while Everard was occupied with his mother. "I know I was in the corridor," I said. She turned to look at me. "I know you were," she said. "You could see the door from where you were kneeling." "Yes." "You told him anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Across the room, Everard was listening to his mother with the patient attention he always gave her, the slight tilt of his head that meant he was genuinely interested in what she was saying. "He asked me carefully enough," Myra said, and her voice had that small warmth in it that was entirely private and entirely her own. "And he waited." She watched him across the room. "I had not expected that of him, the patience. I thought he would be impatient." "He is," I said. "With almost everything else." She smiled then, small and private, and turned slightly away from me so that it was almost not meant to be seen. "I know," she said. "He is very impatient with architects, and with slates, and with people who are late, and with arguments that are not arguments but simply volume raised in lieu of reason." She paused. "I have found that he is not at all impatient with things that matter." Across the room, Everard looked up and met my eyes. Then he looked at his wife. The expression on his face was the one I had seen at the altar, the open window, after all the years. Some secrets, I think, were never meant to be kept indefinitely. They were only ever waiting for the right question, asked carefully enough, with the patience to wait through the silence for an honest answer. The door, once open, does not close again. He told me later, much later, on a different evening in the same room with the same brandy and the same low fire, that he had thought about the letters on the rug for a long time after that first morning. Not what they contained, what they meant about the person holding them. That someone had carried something for 3 years with such care and such grace, alone, and had never let it make her smaller or harder or less than herself. He said that he thought this was the bravest thing he had encountered in a long life of encountering things that were supposed to be brave, and that it was the thing he thought of first when he woke in the mornings, and he hoped, he said, that he would go on thinking of it for a very long time. He does, I know, because he told me again last week. Some things, it turns out, a man cannot stop telling,